of 2025 ever. If you haven't already and you'd like to say hi and say where you're calling in from in the chat, that would be delightful. So today we have joining us Priyasha Mukhopadhyay, who's calling in from Yale, and she's here to talk about her book, Required Reading, The Life of Everyday Texts in the British Empire, which is super exciting. So I'm going to pass the proverbial mic to Priyasha and we'll have her talk, and then afterwards we'll have some time for Q&A and a bit of discussion with her. So whenever you're ready, Priyasha, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you also to Alison and Preeti for inviting me to share my work with all of you. So let me. Can everyone see my slides? Great.
Yeah.
All right. So as Sarah said, I published a book last year called Required Reading, The Life of Everyday Texts in the British Empire. So what I thought I'd do today is talk a little bit about the major stakes of the book and then give you some, more extended examples of what I'm trying to do from a specific chapter. So required reading recovers the story of how everyday forms of writing, from the bureaucratic report to the almanac, came to dominate the cultural imagination of the British Empire and South Asia from the late 19th to the early 20th centuries. One of the key contentions of my book is that we can understand how people oriented themselves to the institution of empire by looking at how they interacted with its material debris. In my chapters, I focus on a number of different examples: a soldier's manual, a cache of bureaucratic documents, a collection of astrological almanacs, and the run of a women's literary magazine. In the book, I offer the concept of the functional archive as a way in which to understand the linkages I observe between texts and other texts and texts and people. Everyday texts didn't operate in isolation. They worked in constellations, mutually reinforcing each other, with one text spawning the need for other texts. A single petition, for example, could generate countless follow-up petitions and reports as it made its way through the corridors of court systems, government offices, and document repositories. The validity of a gun license rested on the material infrastructure of supporting documents, ordinances, application forms, and registration ledgers. Traversing relationships of production and reception, the functional archive was the backbone of imperial life. Required reading is a history of reading under duress. I use the word duress to lay bare the visible and invisible pressures of the colonial state that coerced readers into textual relationships that weren't always of their own making. Sometimes these were outrightly forced, at other times they were strongly suggested, but in all cases, to read under duress was to acknowledge the environments of power in which texts were produced, circulated, and made compulsory. I uncover the intimate connections that readers formed with texts, connections that manifested as anger, exhaustion, helplessness, expediency, and playfulness. But as we all know very well, the line from requirement to actual compliance was far from straight. Just because a book or document was mandated didn't mean that people read it. It also really didn't mean that these texts were even readable. I chart a history of reading under duress that then comes hand in hand with a counter history of readerly resourcefulness, with readers bending regulations, deliberately flouting requirements, and finding creative ways to compensate for the failures of texts and the limits of their own skills. In a sense, then, required reading is a small stab at a very big question. What exactly is reading? Collectively, the readers in my book make us pause to consider what counts as a response to a text: holding it, owning it but never opening it, never reading the whole, only sampling bits and pieces, extracts and summaries, listening to somebody talk about it. My aim in required reading isn't to provide yet another counter definition of reading. Instead, I want to claim the label of reading for the range of affective and intellectual responses that people had to the functional archive. This is an acknowledgement of what I see as the porousness of reading, its ability to encompass an array of different practices, values, and effects. As I show in the chapters of my book, readers' encounters with an almanac or an account book activated a range of unexpected responses that often borrowed from the feeling and vocabulary ascribed to reading literary texts. Selectively read almanacs and impenetrable account books became springboards for intimate readerly relationships. In this light, I claim practices of half reading, not reading, and handling, not simply as reading adjacent, but as integral to how we understand our interpretive methods of meaning making. So at the end of the talk, I'm happy to, give you an overview of the main chapters of my book, if that's of interest. But what I wanted to do today was start right in the middle with chapter 3, which is called Reading for Time. And chapter 3 is about these very weird, strange books that I've become completely obsessed with, called Ponjikas. So what are Ponjikas? Ponjikas are astrological almanacs. Written in Bengali, they were essential tools for daily Hindu religious practice. Each volume contained astrological charts and tables that allowed readers to find auspicious times for rituals and domestic events. So the books were bound by the calendar year, starting on the first day of the Bengali New Year, which is usually in mid-April, and ending the following April. The daily entries of the almanac were presented as a series of astrological phenomena, listing auspicious and inauspicious times. So a reader could consult a Ponjika to determine if, say, December 12th was a good day to get married. A Ponjika could even indicate the precise window of time in which the ceremony would have to be performed to ward off bad luck and to ensure that the marriage lasted. Armed with this information, readers could tailor the prescriptions of these volumes to their own specific needs. So in my book, I look at the Ponjika at a very particular and vibrant moment in its history. Prior to the 19th century, such information was accessed exclusively in handwritten manuscripts or in oral form via an expert local astrologer. Printed Ponjikas began to appear in Bengal only as late as 1818, and in their earliest forms looked a lot like their manuscript counterparts. But by the end of the 19th century, which is the period that I focus on, Bengal witnessed what we could only think of as an almanac printing boom, with hundreds of thousands of copies being sold each year. As it became a mass-produced genre, Ponjikas underwent a series of dramatic changes. The first of these was the inclusion of bureaucratic information in the volumes. So we start seeing things like railway timetables, postal rates, lists of government holidays. Then from around the 1880s, we see a second shift where advertisements for goods ranging from jewelry to hair oil to real and imagined cures for all kinds of weird diseases start being published in the volumes as well. The combination of religious and bureaucratic information transformed the Ponjika into a conduit between two forms of time. So on the one hand, we have local astrological time, but on the other hand, we have imperial bureaucratic time. And what the Ponjika did was invite colonial subjects to participate in an act of temporal oscillation that ultimately obviated the choice between traditional religious obligations and the demands of a bureaucratic world. For these readers, astrological auguries pertained as much to train travel as it did to religious rituals. So they could check the astrological section of their Ponjikas to find an auspicious window in which to travel, and then they could flip to the back, find the railway timetable, and find a train that would fit in this exact window. If its astrological prescriptions could assist Bengali Hindus in living auspicious lives, the Ponjika's new elements, part advertising billboard, part Yellow Pages directory, provided another kind of self-help. It offered readers the tools to grapple with the unreadability of empire's new infrastructures and the transformations of capitalist modernity. While the future under the British looked uncertain and terrifying, a Punjika gave its readers the comfort of finding agency in how they orchestrated and anticipated their own lives. The expanded volumes quickly rose to the status of required reading, a necessary companion to all sections of Bengali Hindu society. Without one, accomplishing basic tasks wasn't just ill-advised, it was virtually impossible. By the end of the 19th century, the cheap mass-printed punjika was ubiquitous. So here's a picture of a punjika that I found in an archive that I will talk about shortly. Anyway, I won't tell you what I'm going to say about it right now. But here are some graphs that can give you a sense of the punjika printing and publishing landscape across the 19th century. Here we see the print runs of different punjika publishers in this period. And as you can see, there are two publishers that dominate the market at this time, PM Bakshi and the Gupta Press, which I will say much more about in a second. And this graph here gives you a kind of sense of the cumulative upward trajectory of punjika publication, where you see a sudden massive spike at the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century here. So in the time that I have left, what I'm going to do is give you a very, very condensed, short version of the reader's history of the punjika that I write about in my book. And one of the things I want to flag is that in this history, I care less about the information that the punjikas contained and more about the history of how this information was received and circulated in the hands of readers. And one of the things I want to show is how these little books elicited a range of different meaning-making practices that conjured up different kinds of affective worlds that show us the fundamental contradictions at the heart of living in the British Empire at the end of the 19th century. So when I started this project, I began looking for punjikas in all the usual places one goes to when one wants to look for old things. I went to the National Library of India in Kolkata, and I went to the British Library in London. And as often happens with archival research, I was immediately disappointed because I found that they had plenty of copies of these books, but all of them were in perfect condition. There was not a single torn page, and there was not a single frayed edge. And I basically found absolutely no annotations or marks in them. They were, in fact, so pristine that it looked like literally nobody had ever opened these books to read them. And of course, this was because most of the books had been deposited in these libraries in the year in which they were published. And so they'd only really passed to the hands of historians and scholars. Of course, for somebody working on the history of reading, this made uncovering traces and practices of reading at best an act of guesswork, and at worst, a fantasy. But over the course of my research, I discovered a private collection of historical punjikas that was maintained by the Gupta Press, a historic Calcutta publisher that has produced an annual almanac every year since 1869. So the archive, which you can see here, is the work of a single individual, Orijit Roy Chaudhary, who is the current head of the press and a fourth-generation Punjika publisher. A sense of historical obligation and the desire to document the history of the company drove Roy to assemble and preserve some of the earliest mass-printed books circulating in Bengali. Made up of copies of used punjikas donated by families living across North Kolkata, the collection showcases a range of publishers who dominated the 19th century market. These copies, well used in their historical time, bear the marks of intensive engagement. They're filled with notes hastily scrawled in the margins, board doodles on the back flaps, self-inserted errata, and emendations to the printed text. This, as you can imagine, turned out to be a gold mine for my work. I had assumed correctly that punjikas weren't meant to be read from cover to cover in a sustained way. But my work with the press's collection allowed me to systematically reconstruct the ways in which 19th century readers actually interacted with these volumes. And what I'm going to do is share with you two examples of how they did this. So if the punjika conjured up the vision of a selective reader for me, my exploration of 19th century volumes identified a countervailing presence, the corrective reader. While selective readers were quick and careless, corrective readers were slow and deliberate. Their reading practices were marked by the great deal of time they spent with their punjikas, manually editing and repairing copies of these incalcitrant volumes. The corrective readers' careful labor transformed their punjikas into more accessible texts that were easier to consult. Put another way, they retooled the volumes for future acts of selective reading. The fact that most people threw away their punjikas at the end of the calendar year might seem to confirm scholarly beliefs about the almanac as a disposable genre. But the care the corrective reader showed towards these volumes demonstrates to us how disposability can sit alongside intense and meaningful readerly relationships. That corrective and selective reading were inseparable and mutually reinforcing complicates well-worn narratives about the kinds of relationships that people develop with ephemeral genres. So selective reading is obviously aided by simple tools, things like page numbers and tables of contents and indexes. But we can see that the owner of this copy of an 1895 to 96 Gupta Press Punjika discovered no less than 15 misnumbered sections in this particular index. Making careful emendations, the reader has compensated for these errors by neatly striking out the incorrect page number and pen and substituting it with the accurate one. In sharp contrast to narratives of ephemerality that surround punjikas, this exercise embodies a deep sense of care for the text. After detecting a mismatch between a listed page number and its content, the reader would have had to work their way through the volume, search for where the items were listed in the actual text, and then note the correct page numbers. While punjikas were designed for selective reading, the misleading index opens this copy to an intensive engagement start to finish. This exhaustive read was meant to eliminate the need for repeat performances, restoring the text to its intended status as selective reading material. By investing their time renumbering this index, the reader saves future minutes and seconds. After all, punjikas were books that were consulted repeatedly, even if read selectively. The copies I consulted in my research at the Gupta Press offices were frayed and bent, bearing the marks of being read and reread. I imagine the corrective reader thumbing hurriedly through the volumes, as other readers would have too, often damaging the pages in the process. Another example of readers' feelings of impatience and frustration leading to acts that demonstrate enormous care and patience can be found in a copy of a Gupta Press Punjika for 1888 to 89. As you can see in this photograph, 4 printed pages from the astrological section, presumably torn or damaged, are missing. Taking their place in the volume are handwritten replacements. A reader has neatly copied the information on the 4 pages by hand, properly formatted and all, onto blank pages and placed them in this copy. The mended book, as a result, is a patchwork combination of print and manuscript. And here's the sort of second and third pages of that small collection here. The Reader's Act acknowledges the fragility of this text and the short lifespan of its pages. In doing so, it reclaims the Punjika as an object that can now be read again. In fact, I find the fact that the reader didn't replace their damaged copy with a new one striking, especially given how cheap and available these books were. The evidence of care that we find in this Punjika points to some readers saving their copies for retrospective consultation instead of just throwing them away at the end of the year. Given the rapid turnaround rates of Punjika production, it would have, we imagine, been extraordinarily difficult to track down and, say, buy a Punjika from 5 or 6 years ago. This brings me to my second example, which is about annotations of a different kind. So as I've said, these Punjikas that I studied were published in Bengali. English appears only sparsely in the volumes, often as part of advertisements or in the bureaucratic section. For example, you can see here that slogans and other parts of advertisements were often in English, as you see the name of this particular cure for gonorrhea emblazoned in English over an ascetic. I was, I admit, surprised to find marginal notes in English in the Gupta Press archive. We can surmise that these English annotations in Bengali language texts were the handiwork of Bengali English literate men, whose proficiency in English was orders of magnitude higher than that of women in this period, even as women were the primary audience for these volumes. Unlike the practical annotations of the corrective reader, English annotations operated as signs of other kinds of textual engagement that exceeded the informational role of these astrological compendia come advertising volumes. These are instances of interactions with punjikas that weren't driven by the desire to extract pieces of information from them. So here's an example of what we might consider a serious note qualifying as an annotation, in the sense that it demonstrates a direct engagement with the printed text on the page. In this case, a conscientious reader has transliterated into Roman script the title of a book in a publishing house's advertisement. So there is no translation from Bengali, which reads Upokhan Manjari, into English, which would be Garland of Stories, to accompany it. The absence of a translation marks the absence of a second reader, someone else at whom the annotation is directed. The annotator and the reader, we can assume, are one and the same in this case. So I was first a little stunned when I saw this, because transliterations of this kind were a common archival practice. So when you go to the British Library, for example, you'll find other examples of transliteration of this sort in South Asian language books. But what confused me was that this copy of the Punjika, obviously, had never actually been housed in an institutional repository like the British Library, and had passed through the hands of no librarians and no professional readers, or the kinds of professional readers who would write in historical books at any rate. As a book that was read and circulated among everyday Bengali readers for its content, not for its historical or archival value, we can assume that the transliteration is the work of an everyday reader literate in Bengali and English. It's difficult to say what the point of the transliteration was. Whether for pen practice or out of sheer boredom, what we can do is surmise the effect of the transliterated title in the 19th century Punjika. Hanging above the Bengali, the foreign English note defamiliarizes the familiar Bengali title. With neither glossing the other, their juxtaposition replays the tension of the English and the Bengali, the colonial and the local, that is at the heart of these particular volumes. So moving gears a little, the late 19th century Punjikas did sort of invite readers to write in them, because they often came with blank pages at the end, which made many of these copies unique. But as I discovered, readers wrote all over almanacs, not just in designated spaces for their notes. So the astrological section of a Punjika published by Day Law and Co. in 1871 to 72 revealed a note straight across the astral chart for 29th Choitra, or April 10th in the Gregorian calendar, that reads, and I don't know if you can see or sort of figure out the text clearly from the photograph, but the note reads, at 10 minutes past 9 in the morning, J.N. Sen got a son. Now, punjikas were not customarily used to record significant events like births and deaths, as family Bibles were. But unpacking the annotation itself, the language, the invocation of a time and date, and the placement of the note can tell us something again about this oscillation between the astral and the imperial that is central to the punjika. Look at the detail at 10 minutes past 9 in the morning. This is an unambiguous allusion to the dreaded imperial clock time that was taking over homes and offices across colonial India. There's also the placement of the annotation, superimposing the English note over the Bengali text. The Bengali text underneath is eclipsed by the English handwritten note over it, but it can still be read. What this does is create the effect of a kind of palimpsest, of notes on top of notes, of languages layered on top of other languages. The example of this annotation allows us to unpack how Bengali readers located themselves in their almanacs and by extension, within the unyielding structures of the British Empire. The English note and the Bengali text present a clash, but it is a clash in which they are both readable and meaningful, both referencing and reinforcing each other. In doing so, the note opens the possibility of a new world in which the new world that the Punjika is working towards, a world in which the English and Bengali, the imperial and the astral coexist, neither more familiar nor foreign than the other. Thank you.
Thank you, Priyasha. That was fascinating. So I have a lot of questions, but I'm sure other people do too. So you're welcome to raise your hands and unmute, or if you'd like to pop them in the chat, I'm happy to read them for people. All right, perhaps I can get us started then if it's not selfish. I'm sorry, Priti, do you want to go first? Okay. Um, so this was a new field of information for me, so I'm absolutely fascinated. I wondered if you could maybe say a little bit about if there was any kind of official relationship between these British colonials and this type of work? Like, is there any kind of government oversight or
Mm.
censorship or involvement in the presses or the people that are making these texts?
Mm. That's a great question. And so the answer is there were attempts at government oversight that basically failed. So, from the mid 19th century onwards, we see systematic efforts, mostly by missionaries and other government organizations, to clamp down on almanacs of this sort because they were seen as sort of harboring the natural superstitious tendencies of natives in India. And various Christian organizations actually tried to come up with alternative almanacs that had useful information that they thought would be helpful to Indian readers. But they didn't really gain a significant audience, and nobody seemed particularly interested in them for what it's worth. So there was definitely an attempt to clamp down on them, but that attempt sort of evaporated very quickly. But there was definitely a sense that reading almanacs and specifically astrological ones was not good, and people should not be doing that. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Priti?
I'm sorry.
Um, Wonderful. Thank you so much, Priyasha. I love the book. I love the work. And I'm so delighted. I love that you talked about the Panjikas in this talk. Partly because for a completely personal reason, my ancestors are astrologers, Jyotishis.
Mm.
This is where my name Joshi comes from. So that is my the men in the Pandit family were astrologers. So I'm delighted that you spoke about it, but also because that chapter is the one that I think for me opens so many questions and so many connectors to the
Mm.
work that we do in periodical
Mm.
studies. Um, and I just wanted to sort of name some of them, and then sort of open a conversation about the ways in which the work you're doing, which is of course about reading, but your archive, is pulling at the edges of the
Mm.
periodical archive in, I think, really productive and interesting
Mm.
ways, whether that was your focus or not. So, I mean, I'll just sort of, say that, I mean, the Panjika is, of course, the stretched outer edge of seriality.
Right.
Right. I mean, we know about seriality, that is, daily, if it's a newspaper, or
Mm.
weekly, if it's a weekly
Mm.
newspaper, or monthly, those
Mm.
kinds. But the Panjika is about seriality,
Mm.
except it's that serial time is annual, is 365 days. So it stretches the calendar. And in stretching the calendar, there are two things that I'd really love to hear you and maybe others talk about too. Um, it shifts the notions of ephemerality and
Mm.
disposability that are so that our field has to work with,
Mm,
right? And certainly I work in newspapers, and newspapers are particularly, I mean, that term that Benedict Arnold uses, right? One day bestsellers,
yeah.
and the next morning they're used in the toilet.
Mm,
But that sort of disposability and ephemerality, even though you encountered it when you first went to the
mm,
BL and all
right.
the places,
Yeah.
eh, eh, there isn't that. And I think for me, what's really relevant in this sort of in focus on your focus on Panjikas as a form for us to consider here
Mm,
is the repeated reading,
mm,
which you don't get. Again, I work in newspapers. This is different in periodicals. I mean, in magazines and of other kinds. But in
mm,
newspapers, there's not that much repeated reading,
mm.
right?
Right. Mm,
They are repeat readers,
mm,
right? The
mm,
newspaper is then passed on to somebody,
mm,
or in the circulating library, many
mm,
readers, but there's not repeated reading.
mm,
So in some ways, your book is about reading, but I just sort of wanted to open those
mm,
questions about how the stretch timeline
mm.
of the
Right.
year
Mm,
and the different kind of reading connects with, what we do in periodical studies so much. So there's not really a question, it's really an invitation for conversation
yeah.
from
Okay.
you and others.
No, thank you so much, Preeti. And that's a great way of sort of thinking about it. And it's sort of, as you said, the Ponjika kind of, I think, because it is a serial form in that it is bound by the year, but it sort of stands in terms of the way in which readers respond to it, kind of between, say, a novel that you might hold on for a really long time, and the newspaper, on the other hand, that you presumably check out the next day or find some, non-readerly purpose for, so to speak. And that's what I think I found fascinating about it, that it sort of like invites this constant sense of rereading, but you only do that rereading for the duration of the calendar year. So occasionally people did go back to look at Ponjikas to, like, astrologers would go and look at older ones to, say, make birth charts for people. So you go back to a Ponjika from, 1890, because that's the year when somebody was born, to sort of figure out their horoscope and astrological configurations. But most people were like, this is the Ponjika for 1890 to 1891. I don't really need it after that, so to speak. So it is kind of, as you said, a sort of interesting object in that it stretches how long you hold on to it as an ephemeral genre, but its use kind of collapses after that for most readers. And I think the fact that it's organized by day is really interesting for me too, that you kind of move through it serially in that sense, from the 14th or 15th of April to the next 14th or 15th of April. But you might jump to and from one day to another, so it's sort of like unfolds in a serial calendar like manner, but you don't necessarily consult it in that way, in that you might want to know what auspicious dates and times look like 2 months ahead of where you are right now. So there's that kind of back and forth within the volume as well, which I think is really interesting, so to speak. And one of the things that I didn't get into as much today, but which I talk about a lot in the chapter, is just the way in which the form of the almanac in this period deals with that really fraught question of temporality itself. That there are these sort of astrological norms of structuring time, and then there are sort of secular norms of clock time that are coming in with the standardization of time too. And I don't think you could quite tell from the images that I had on the screen, but by the end of the 19th century, Punjika publishers were using both. So at the beginning of each entry for the day, you'd have the date and the month according to the Bengali calendar, but you'd also have it according to the Gregorian or the British calendar. So you've kind of got that tension of time operating in every single entry of the Punjika, which I find really fascinating. I could go on, but I didn't know if other people wanted to jump in.
Yes, Joanne, please.
Thank you. I haven't yet had the pleasure of reading your book, and I'm looking forward to doing it. And I hope I'm not going to derail the conversation. But I was struck when you were you're talking about everyday texts in the British Empire, and then also about what you said with the coexistence of the Bengali and English readers, and that um, overleaf on the almanac of the delivery of a son. But
Mm.
my question really stems from my one visit to the National Library of India when I was taken to the store and I saw there the most fantastic collection of three-volume 19th century novels that I have ever seen. And I just remember one whole area was G.P.R. James, and all of his novels were there. So who were their readers, and why it were three-volume 19th century novels from novelists, not just the major ones but minor ones and very prolific ones. Who were their readers, and why were they in Calcutta, or Calcutta as it was until 1906?
That's a great question. And the person who's actually written the most about this is Priya Joshi, Preeti's sister, who sort of talks about how there's this extraordinary moment in which popular, sentimental 19th century fiction that doesn't really seem to have an audience in Britain after a point kind of explodes in the Indian market and becomes the kinds of texts that English literate readers are flocking to. And in my own book, I see that really clearly in a chapter that I did not talk about. Which is on the Indian Ladies magazine. And this magazine would often sort of publish reviews and essays about, British novels or texts that the editor thought Indian readers should be reading. And we see all the usual suspects. We see, people like Marie Corelli and others who are constantly being touted as reasonable people to be read by a 19th century Indian reader who's sort of looking to enrich their lives. So it's really beautiful to sort of see that synthesis sort of coming together, where we see people reading these texts, or I read Priya Joshi's book when I was in grad school, and then when I started looking at things for my own book, I was like, oh yes, here I see Marie Corelli in the archive as well, being read and discussed, which is really interesting and exciting.
So these were not reading people who were reading under duress. They were reading for pleasure.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
And then, Preeti, did you want to chime in a moment ago, or no?
Well, I was just going to chime in with a little bit of a person. So, my sister Priya, whose book In Another Country is the one Priyasha is mentioning, she was not trained as a 19th century scholar. She's actually was trained as a modernist, and then she wrote this dissertation, which became her award-winning book. But when she first started to work on this archive, and actually in the Madras and Calcutta archives to see what Indians were reading, she would call me up and she'd say, have you ever heard about this person named Marie Corelli? Who is this person? I've never heard of them. So, yeah, the canon was not made up of Dickens and Bronte and Eliot and all of that. The canon in India.
Yes.
Lovely. All right. Are there other people who'd like to raise their hands and unmute or pop them in the chat? Okay, well then I wonder, 'cause I also have not had the chance to read your book yet, although it's jumping to my TBR. Actually, sorry, I have a question, but I'll save it first and maybe defer to Allison. Would you like to give your question?
Oh, sure. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Sarah.
No, not at all.
But Priyasha, that was completely fascinating. And I'm working with British serial print, so forgive me, that's kind of my specialism. I'm really fascinated with kind of serial rhythms and the varying interconnected forms that are very kind of complicated, as we all know, and how the reader's experience of genre and form and so on. And then just the materiality of reading is shaped by these colliding different times. And I haven't read your book yet, and I'm looking forward to doing that. But it sounds from your introduction that you're covering an enormous and exciting range of kinds of material in the book in terms of, reading for time. And I'm wondering if you could say something about how you had to kind of adapt your methods, your conceptual approach to this sense of ephemerality and seriality and so on, kind of based on what you were finding and how you were, I don't know, maybe having to invent vocabulary even for this and kind of approaches that didn't exist. Because I know a lot of our members ask about methods when they're working with like new material and quite complex material. And I'm wondering how the temporality frame works within that for you too.
Oh, that's a really great question. I think I think when I started working on this project, my general sense was of feeling overwhelmed in the archive, which I imagine is a feeling that all of us have felt entering these spaces. And I think this is something that colonial historians have said, people working on serial print at the 19th century have said. But I think it's sort of worth repeating that I feel like we talk a lot about there not being as much stuff as there used to be, in the sense that what we have preserved is so little compared to what did exist, and yet it is still so much. And I think when I started my research for this book, one of the things I wanted to do was sort of find a productive intellectual way of dealing with that sense of being overwhelmed. And because I kept on, once I started working on bureaucratic documents, there's literally no end to the number of bureaucratic documents you can call up to the reading room in the British Library, so to speak. And I think that's kind of where this term that I invented for the book helped me sort of shape what I was dealing with in the archive, which is the idea of the functional archive. That when I'd call up a text, it would lead to me calling up another text, and it would lead to me calling up another text. And suddenly I had this entire string of texts that, I connected to each other, but were kind of historically connected too, in the sense that one text was required for the other text to do its job. And like the example that I started with, something like a license, underneath a license, you have all kinds of different documents kind of supporting it. And I think the temporality issue is really interesting in that regard too, because it's the functional archive kind of works in creating these textual links, but they're links that persist over time in this. And again, going back to Preeti's question about temporality at the beginning, there's the kind of immediate time boundness, right? Like a license expires at the end of 10 years, 5 years, whatever the duration of the license is, and then you have to renew it. But there are other kinds of documents that something in the 19th century links to an object in the 20th century, links to an object in the 21st century. So you've kind of got the small time boundedness of connections, and then you've got a much broader sort of historical durée of these objects working together as well. And I think that's kind of what makes archival work in general, I guess, challenging, of sort of dealing with those competing temporalities of the things working in their own historical moment, but then kind of being preserved and operating in the 21st century of our moment as well. Yeah.
Can I just quickly say that I love Allison's comment, and I love your response, because when you literally just started your talk and you said everyday forms of writing, and then there are all these follow-ups, I wrote in my notes here, in some ways those follow-ups are a different kind of seriality. I mean, you're interested in them as somebody who works on reading, but like literally it had never occurred to me reading your book, and until you said it, I thought, oh my God, those follow-ups become a different form of seriality, one not produced by the creators of that
Right.
genre, but by a series of readers over different temporalities. So absolutely lovely. And just, I think, yeah, sorry, go.
No, and I think that's a really cool way of thinking about it. And what I like about the bureaucratic documents specific form of seriality is that you have so many different readers and writers kind of operating in a cycle where, you've got the first petition and then it moves on, and then you've got a follow-up petition, then you've got the bureaucrat reading it. And it's just, a really beautiful kind of generative path forward, so to speak. And then, petition is done, it gets, put into a file and, lies and, in a cupboard somewhere, encountering a slow death of some kind in the archive. So yeah.
All right, it looks like we have a question in the chat from Ryan. So they say, this was amazing. I can't get on microphone, but I had a question about the way affect registers in these almanacs. I'm thinking of your great early chapter from the book on the kind of humorous irritation or disaffection swirling around military manuals. And I'm thinking too about the birth announcement that you just discussed, which is so clearly charged with emotional meaning, even as it seems so bureaucratically inert, or even about the care registered in the very presentation of this archive. I was wondering if you could speak more on that here.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the birth announcement and the affective register there is a really interesting way of thinking about it, because as Ryan rightly points out, we've got the kind of cold tone of somebody had a son, kind of almost like a birth certificate announcement, sort of plonked in the middle of the Punjika, but also, the affective moment of a birth being recorded or announced or remembered in that kind of way. And I think one of the things that the chapter does, okay, I guess there are two different ways in which the chapter thinks about affect. I think one of the things that really compelled me in this, in working with these volumes, was thinking about the kind of care and attention that people paid to them, that there was a certain kind of deference is not really the word for it, because Punjikas they were sort of used in religious ritual, but they weren't like religious texts. So people often kept them in the same room as, household gods and things like that. But they weren't quite like you didn't treat them in the way in which you would treat a Bible, say. But they still seem to sort of conjure up some kind of affection or closeness that I found really compelling for what are essentially fairly mundane, everyday vehicles, which I like thinking about. And I think the other sort of affective register is just thinking about the way in which the Ponjika sort of marks this frustration that the reader is encountering, of kind of a frustration that comes out of the clash of a new sort of world swirling around them with colonial modes of time, etc. And on the other hand, an attempt to sort of cling on to or grasp on to an old way of life, which is the astrological way of life. And I think the Ponjika is both like an enormously affective and emotional, but also practical way of getting around that problem. And I think in post-colonial studies, we often pay a lot of attention and emphasis on forms of resistance, right? The way in which colonial subjects pushed against boundaries, etc. And I think the Punjika is a really interesting object to think about the ways in which readers found methods and means of making do, in the sense that no one was trying to topple over empire in the Punjika. Readers were trying to just get on with their lives in whatever practical, meaningful, organized way in which they could. And I found that sort of interesting and compelling as a way of thinking about affect and relationships with the British Empire.
That reminds me even of an earlier conversation that we were having in here about time. I think even that kind of continuing to use that annual structure of like we start on April 1st and we go through the year and not ever, like I think that's another unit of time in addition to that competing thing that you were talking about with having a Gregorian date and like a more like a traditional date. Seems to fit that way too. And I wonder, maybe for people who have not, kind of speaking to myself here too, have not read your book yet, could you maybe tell us a little bit more about some of the other kinds of, maybe if they are, or maybe how you're seeing some of that tension register and some of the other kinds of things that you talk about in the book?
Sure, absolutely. I brought some pictures, so I can share my slides again and give you a sense of what is happening in the rest of the book. Just give me a second. Okay, so all right. So as I think Ryan alluded to this already in the comment, but the first chapter of the book focuses on a soldier's manual. It's a kind of field guide to colonial war that was written by Garnet Wolseley in 1869. And Garnet Wolseley was this superstar of and rising star in the British military. He's basically in every single British colonial war across the 19th century. He became a household name. His face was on, tobacco and tea tins and all kinds of stuff. And he writes this book that he thinks is going to be a mega hit when it's published. And, it has some success in that, soldiers are required to carry it around and things like that. But one of the things I discovered was that in its time, absolutely nobody read it. And most of its reception that I managed to uncover from various kinds of archives was people talking about how much they hated it and how nobody wanted to read it. And I was really fascinated with this idea of a reception history that was essentially a non-reception or an anti-reception, but it also opened up larger questions of what it meant to be a British soldier posted in India at the end of the 19th century away from home, using or not using this guide as a way of figuring out how to move around one's place in empire. I realized I didn't actually, sorry, okay. Okay, so the second chapter is about bureaucratic documents, and most of the documents that I look at are from late 19th and early 20th century Sri Lanka. And one of the things that I was really interested in thinking about in that chapter was the way in which the bureaucratic document kind of unsettles the distinction between the literate and the illiterate. Because what I discovered was that bureaucratic documents, more than any other kind of document I've encountered, really gained readers, so to speak, from across the literacy spectrum, in that there were people who could read who had to deal with them, and there were people who couldn't read in 19th century South Asia who still needed licenses and needed to file petitions and things like that. I really loved this particular archival find, because one of the literary texts I write about in that chapter is Leonard Woolf's novel, The Village in the Jungle, which is a kind of fictional account of his time in Sri Lanka as a colonial administrator before he married Virginia Woolf. And when I visited the archive, I discovered a gun license signed by Leonard Woolf that literally just fell out of a file into my lap, which was amazing. And a lot of the novel is about a person trying to get a gun license renewed. And so this became a kind of material a material object that linked the novel to the world in a really meaningful way. And then I've talked about the third chapter already. And the fourth chapter, which is a little more periodical studies like, is about the Indian Ladies magazine, which was a political and literary magazine that was published in the early 20th century, so beginning from 1901, that had articles about all kinds of things. So it had, literary articles and, puzzles like the Shakespeare names puzzle that you could see on the screen here, but it also had minutes of political meetings and recipes and original fiction and things like that too. And what that chapter does is kind of focus on the way in which the English literary canon appears as a kind of form of required reading for a specific kind of early 20th century Indian reader.
Thank you. And I really appreciate that you came prepared with extra like bonus pictures to and examples to show us. That is so cool. So we're coming close to the end of our time, but I don't want to prematurely like cut people's questions off. Does anyone have anything else they'd like to ask Priyasha while she's with us? Okay, well then I'll just say thank you, Priyasha, so much for taking the time to talk about your book with us. I am so excited to read. I think lots of people are going to be looking it up in the next few minutes after we finish up here. And like Allison said in the chat, just a quick shout out, our next RSVP event kicking off 2026 is going to be January 23rd, and we'll have a visit from Beth Gaskell talking about collecting, managing, and digitizing a national collection at the British Library. So please try to stop by for that if you can. But thank you again to Priyasha so much. And I hope everyone has a lovely holiday season coming up.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I know this is a very onerous time of year for all of us, so I really appreciate it.
This is a